During the Spanish-American War, African Americans had fought next to whites and were beginning to use their skills and newfound freedom to become respected, productive members in society. They had begun to hold positions of power and various jobs previously held by whites only. However, many white people of the time did not see the equality as a good sign and became alarmed. In Wilmington, African Americans made up a significant portion of the population, and they were the majority of the voting population. Since African Americans held many positions of power, the white population was afraid that they were losing their grip on the power in the city. This spurred the beginning of the Party of White Supremacy, which argued that the Democratic Party could save the people from Negro rule. To help restore the power, Frenfold Simmons, Josephus Daniels, and Charles Aycock designed a campaign portraying white women endangered by the African American men in office. This also brought to surface another sensitive issue of interracial couples involving an African American woman and a white man, and how it was considered inappropriate. Voting became a controversial topic because whites were threatening African Americans and discouraging them from voting, and African American women were threatening African American men if they did not vote. Despite many African American men turning out for the vote, all of the African American candidates were outvoted. However, this was not good enough for the people of Wilmington, and they drove the African American officials out of office. While the African American officials were targeted, no one was safe, and a massacre took place in the streets of Wilmington. Despite begging for help from the White House, President McKinley stayed out of the issue. Once the African American population had been removed from office and run out of town, the ads turned to promoting the segregation of everything: transportation, restrooms, schools, essentially all public areas. However, some people saw the Jim Crow laws as an obstacle to be overcome. One such person was Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She returned to North Carolina to teach, and she opened up her own school. Receiving funding was difficult, but she had the girls write letters home telling patrons what they were learning and requesting financial support. While the school appeared to be vocational on the outside, the school also focused on developing well-rounded individuals. She worked to teach the girls that they could be as good as anyone else, regardless of the color of their skin. Within her school, she tried to shelter her students from the racism that surrounded them. While Brown tried to protect her children, many others were unfortunate and were given long, unfair punishments for petty crimes, and often forced to serve on chain gangs. A convict leasing program was started by which landowners or anyone who needed laborers could pay the state for the convicts to come do the labor. It was almost the same thing as slavery, but under a different and crueler set of circumstances. Since the laborers were now seen as convicts, their lives meant even less, and they were treated with unprecedented brutality. They were often treated like animals, kept in cages, beaten, underfed, and forced to work in some of the most inhospitable conditions. In fact, to keep up with demands, ridiculous sentences were passed. While a white male may only get 90 days in jail for petty theft, an African American man would get 2 years on the convict lease program. Even children were being charged harshly. Even though they were being subjected to a form of slavery that made it impossible to live without fear, they were able to come together. Their music and religion helped them unite and find solid ground in the face of uncertainty. In the early 1900s, New Orleans was considered a very liberal city. However, in the 1890s, Jim Crow came to New Orleans. One monumental case was Plessy versus Ferguson. Omar Plessy appeared to be Caucasian. On the train, he was not considered African American until he identified himself as such. After that, he was told to either relocate to the correct seating area or get off the train. In 1896, the case Plessy versus Ferguson allowed for the legalization of segregation under the terms that the accommodations be separate but equal. This law allowed each state to make their laws accordingly. 2 years later, another law allowed states to disqualify African Americans from voting. This caused a severe drop in the African American voters, especially in Louisiana, where they dropped from 130,000 to just 5,000 votes. As their rights and liberties were being stripped away, African Americans found a great means of expression through music. Jazz music changed the way music was written and performed. It challenged and broke down the barriers between African Americans and white communities, and the notion that African American people were inferior. Historically, African Americans had wrongly been identified as inferior and savage. Racism and ignorant fear made people blind to African Americans' talents, education, and skills. This fear was amplified through images and advertising. To help ease the fear and tension in society, Booker T. Washington tried to convince African Americans to work within the system and just drop the issue of civil rights. He gained favor within the community for his approaches to making a business person out of an African American. Many people tried to follow this example and work on developing a life skill that would enable them to get a job and find their place within society. Women even began to specialize in high school and would graduate with a special honor on their diploma. However, W.E.B. Du Bois rejected Washington's ideas because even as they were working within the system, there was still racial terrorism and lynching all across the South. In 1903, Du Bois wrote an attack against Washington, saying that their rights could not be given up and that they should not accept being an unequal race. Although Du Bois disagreed with Washington's ideas, Washington was still able to become one of the most influential African American men in America. He gained support from business persons such as Carnegie and Rockefeller, and even Roosevelt endorsed his program. Even as Washington's fame grew, Du Bois's insults grew more intense. In 1906, Washington visited Atlanta as it was booming, and he considered it a prime example of what African Americans could achieve if they followed his ideas and worked within the system. Unfortunately, his image was constructed from only a few prominent cases of success, when in fact, Atlanta was one of the most segregated cities at the time. Already, Tensions in America were high, but when Thomas Dixon's The Klansman opened in Atlanta, racial tensions mounted. The Klansman reinforced the idea of the lustful, savage African-American male preying on the innocent, young, white female. And in the play, the solution was the Klansman, or the Ku Klux Klan. During the opening week of the play, the press reported several false accusations of rape. This caused mass hysteria, and a mob gathered in downtown Atlanta, leading to a massive riot of whites against the African Americans. When attacked, those who didn't fight were knocked down and beaten up, but those who tried to defend themselves were often killed. Walter White and his father lived in Atlanta at the time and were often mistaken as Caucasians. They prepared themselves in case the riot came to their house. Walter was only 13 at the time. This experience led him to become one of the foremost civil rights leaders in America. After the riot, Washington visited Atlanta to salvage the idea that African Americans could live in close proximity to whites working within the system. He tried to still use Atlanta as the ideal system, but Du Bois used this opportunity to show that it did not work. In 1910, Du Bois moved to New York, joined the NAACP, and became the editor for their publication, The Crisis. When he started writing for the publication, he supported Woodrow Wilson because he promised justice and fairness for African Americans, and Du Bois made it clear what the African American population expected from Wilson. However, after Wilson took office, 3 cabinet members were allowed to segregate their departments, and this enraged Du Bois. In 1915, The Birth of a Nation, the motion picture version of The Klansman, was released. The NAACP launched a campaign to have it banned after outbreaks of violence in cities where the movie played. This film also caused a surge in membership for the Ku Klux Klan and gave Northerners an insight into the amount of racism the South experienced. The fight to have the movie banned and reduce racism was still going when Booker T. Washington died in 1915. Despite their differences, Du Bois praised his work, but also pointed out how little progress African Americans had made under his influence. When President Wilson declared war in 1917, Du Bois reluctantly supported him because he knew that the Army was not free from Jim Crow laws either. In 1917, the 24th Infantry, 3rd Battalion, a segregation of African American soldiers, was assigned to Fort Worth, Texas. At the time, the police were coming down especially hard on African American criminals. The soldiers who were stationed there dealt with non-stop harassment from the police for months and finally had enough. On August 27th, the soldiers mutinied and a riot broke out in the streets of Houston, leaving many dead. On December 11th, 1917, 13 men were tried and hung, some of which were arrested without cause or not told of their crimes or execution dates. One soldier even requested to be shot as a soldier instead of being hung, and that right was denied. These good soldiers, who had fought for America, had enough of racial discrimination. They decided to fight back, but at the cost of their lives.